The aim of this exhibition is to present 500 years of British art to a Spanish audience who are probably unfamiliar with many of the works in the exhibition. We have called it Treasure Island because it is an island, Britain, and there are many treasures. Many of them are hidden. The first section of the exhibition deals with a moment when many of the treasures were destroyed. This happened during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th and 17th century. And so, although we have some very fine portraits, like this one of Lucy Harrington, who was a famous patron of the early 17th century, we also have examples of works that were damaged or even destroyed by the iconoclasts in the 16th and 17th century. So we have broken alabaster medieval sculpture, and we have an illuminated manuscript where the eyes of the saints have been scratched out. The thinking at the time was that the eyes in portraits and images had a power over those who were looking at it, and the idea of the Protestants was to make people read the Bible, not just to look at images. And so the beginning of the exhibition is one both of enormous destruction, and from that destruction, the great sequence of British art since the 16th century. Because of the prohibition on images since the Reformation, British art was dominated in the 16th and 17th centuries by portraiture. But by the middle of the 18th century, there was an enormous taste for landscape art. And of course, the most famous landscape painter is J.M.W. Turner, whose work we see here. This is typical of the more classical style that was so popular with many aristocrats and other collectors in Britain at the end of the 18th century and the turn of the 19th century. But of course there were two other sorts of landscape. One was the more picturesque and rural landscape, which of course we find in artists such as Constable, but also a more sublime and romantic landscape, which of course Turner himself was a great exponent of, but also artists such as John Martin. So from the late 18th century until the middle of the 19th century, we find landscape dominating the history of British art. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were the first self-conscious group of artists in Britain who had a manifesto and a distinct aim and set of principles. And so artists such as Holman Hunt began to paint with enormous precision and clarity, often with a strong photographic feeling to their work. The next generation of artists, such as Edward Burne-Jones, began to paint their dreams, their inspiration in literature, and their work in many respects anticipates that of much European symbolism. At the same time, some artists were looking to the Impressionist artists in Paris, and particularly we see the American painter James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who moved to London in the 1860s, painting pictures of the Thames with an enormous sense of the atmosphere, and yet also looking very clearly at the naturalistic effects of light. In the early 20th century, many British artists responded to the new developments in European art, such as Cubism and Futurism, which we can see in the work of Wyndham Lewis and the Vorticist artists. Later, in the 1930s, we see artists such as Ben Nicholson, again responding to the international modernist movement. And in the case of Nicholson and his colleague Henry Moore, investigating the full range of abstract art. In the 1960s, British popular culture became internationally famous and highly fashionable. And David Hockney, whose work we see behind me, was probably one of those artists who made Britain internationally renowned for its modernity and its embrace of popular culture. Hockney himself, of course, came out as a homosexual early in the 60s. He then moved to California, and the work here shows a number of things. First of all, the hedonistic lifestyle that he was enjoying in California. Secondly, his continuing love for the British tradition of portraiture. Secondly, of course, the interest that he continued throughout his career in landscape and in the natural world. But also you can see in this painting a fascination with hard-edged abstract art and even with a kind of minimalism. So in this work of the mid-60s, we can see many of the currents of British art, both contemporary and historical, coming together. This exhibition ends at the moment that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, and at the moment when the conceptual artists of the 60s and 70s gave way to a new generation. But that, of course, will be another exhibition.